Some nights tear your world apart and rebuild it in ways you never imagined. This was one of those nights when lightning revealed truths that daylight keeps hidden. The storm hammered Seabrook General Hospital like an angry fist, rattling windows and sending rain cascading down the glass in violent sheets. Crystal Freeman gripped the metal rails of her hospital bed, her knuckles white as another contraction tore through her body with the fury of the tempest outside. "Stephen!" she gasped, sweat beading on her dark skin as she searched the delivery room for her husband. "Stephen, please!" But Stephen Higgins was pacing by the window, his cell phone pressed to his ear, his voice a harsh whisper as he conducted what sounded like a business call. Crystal couldn't believe it. Here she was, bringing their child into the world during the worst storm in decades, and he was talking about car sales quotas. "Stephen!" Crystal's voice cracked as another wave of pain crashed over her. The baby was coming fast, too fast, and the hospital was in chaos. The storm had knocked out power to half the building, and the emergency generators were struggling. Nurses rushed between rooms, their faces tense with exhaustion. Dr. Martinez appeared at Crystal's bedside, her expression grim. "Crystal, we need to prep for a possible C-section. The baby's heart rate is dropping, and with these complications—" "What?" Stephen spun around, his face pale. "Surgery?" "But I thought this would be quick and easy. I have a meeting tomorrow morning with the regional manager." "Your wife needs you right now," Dr. Martinez said firmly. "This is serious." Stephen's eyes darted between Crystal and his phone, which was buzzing incessantly. I need to take this call. It's important. The dealership is closing a major deal, and if I don't, more important than your child." Crystal's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the room like a blade. Another contraction hit, this one so intense that Crystal cried out, her body arching off the bed. The lights flickered, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the wail of emergency vehicles struggling through the storm. "I can't do this," Stephen muttered, running his hands through his hair. "This is too much. The blood, the screaming, the chaos. I need air. I need to check on the car, make sure it's not damaged in this flooding." "Stephen, don't you dare," Crystal started, but he was already backing toward the door. "I'll be right back," he lied, his eyes refusing to meet hers. "Just need to move the car to higher ground. This flooding could ruin the paint job, and I just made the final payment." And then he was gone, fleeing into the storm like the coward he'd always been, leaving Crystal alone in the most terrifying moment of her life. Crystal felt something break inside her chest, not just her heart, but her spirit. The man who'd promised to love her through sickness and health, who'd sworn to protect and cherish her, had abandoned her when she needed him most. The pain of his betrayal cut deeper than any contraction. "Mrs. Freeman, I need you to focus on me," Dr. Martinez said, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. "The baby is in distress and we need to—" The delivery room doors burst open with a bang that echoed through the chaos. Crystal expected to see Stephen returning with some pathetic excuse, but instead, a tall stranger strode into the room, his dark hair dripping with rain, his expensive suit soaked through. Brian Lockhart had been at the hospital for an entirely different reason. His shipping company's emergency generator had failed during the storm, and he'd personally driven backup power equipment through the flooded streets. But when he'd heard the sound of a woman crying out in pain and terror, something primal in him had responded. He'd seen Stephen Higgins in the parking lot, fumbling with his car keys and muttering about ruined leather seats while his wife screamed in labor upstairs. The sight had disgusted Brian to his core. Now, standing in the doorway of the delivery room, Brian saw Crystal, beautiful, vulnerable, and utterly alone. Her dark eyes were wide with fear and pain, tears streaming down her cheeks as she faced the most important moment of her life without the man who should have been holding her hand. Brian didn't hesitate. He crossed the room in 3 swift strides. his presence commanding despite the chaos around them. The nurses looked startled, but something about his calm authority made them step aside. "Ma'am," he said, his deep voice cutting through Crystal's panic like a lighthouse beam through fog. He reached for her trembling hand, enveloping it in both of his larger ones. His hands were strong, calloused from years of working on boats despite his wealth, and surprisingly gentle. Crystal looked up into storm-grey eyes that held no pity, only fierce determination and an unexpected tenderness. "You're mine now," Brian said, his voice low but absolutely certain. "I'm not leaving you." The words hit Crystal like a shockwave, not a question, not a request, a declaration. This stranger, this man she'd never seen before, was claiming her in her darkest hour with a conviction that took her breath away. "I don't even know you," Crystal whispered, but she didn't pull her hand away. Something about his presence made her feel safer than she'd felt in months. "You will," Brian replied simply. He turned to Dr. Martinez without releasing Crystal's hand. "What does she need?" "Sir, you can't just—" the doctor began. "She's alone," Brian said, his tone brooking no argument. "Her husband ran. I'm staying. What does she need?" Dr. Martinez looked between them, taking in Crystal's obvious relief at having support and Brian's unwavering determination. "We need to get this baby delivered safely. The storm has complicated everything." Brian nodded and turned back to Crystal, his thumb stroking gently across her knuckles. "Tell me your name." "Crystal," she managed between breaths. "Crystal Freeman." "Crystal," he repeated, and something about the way he said it made it sound like a prayer. "I'm Brian, and I'm going to be right here with you until your baby is safe in your arms." Another contraction hit, and Crystal squeezed Brian's hand so hard she was sure she must be hurting him. But he never flinched, never pulled away. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice steady and calm. "Breathe with me," he instructed. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. Just like riding out a storm at sea, you don't fight the waves, you move with them." Crystal found herself following his breathing pattern, his calm presence somehow cutting through her panic. Outside, thunder crashed and lightning split the sky. But inside this small bubble of space, she felt anchored by this stranger's unexpected strength. "That's it," Brian murmured as the contraction ebbed. "You're incredible. So strong." "Why are you doing this?" Crystal asked, searching his face for some sign of ulterior motive. In her experience, men like him, wealthy, powerful, devastatingly handsome, didn't rescue struggling women out of the goodness of their hearts. Brian was quiet for a moment, his grey eyes thoughtful. "Because everyone deserves to have someone fight for them when they can't fight for themselves," he said finally, "and because no woman should face bringing life into this world alone." Dr. Martinez appeared beside them again. "Crystal, we need to push. The baby's ready, and we can't wait any longer." Terror flooded Crystal's system again. She wasn't ready. How could she do this without Stephen? How could she trust this stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere like some kind of guardian angel? But then Brian's hands tightened around hers, his voice absolutely certain. "You've got this, Crystal. I believe in you completely." And somehow, impossibly, she believed him. The next hour passed in a blur of pain, determination, and Brian's unwavering presence. He never left her side, never showed disgust or discomfort at the raw reality of childbirth. When she needed to squeeze something, he offered his hands. When she needed encouragement, he provided it without hesitation. "She's crowning," Dr. Martinez announced. "One more push, Crystal." One more. Crystal gathered every ounce of strength she had left, Brian's voice in her ear urging her on, and pushed with everything in her. The room exploded with activity as her daughter slipped into the world, tiny and perfect and absolutely beautiful. "She's perfect," Brian breathed, and Crystal realized he was crying. This strong, commanding man was moved to tears by the sight of her child. As the medical team cleaned and examined the baby, Brian finally released Crystal's hands to smooth the damp hair away from her forehead. "You did it," he said softly. "You're the most amazing woman I've ever seen." Crystal stared up at him. This stranger who'd stayed when her husband had fled, who'd given her strength when she had none left. Outside, the storm was calming, but inside this room, everything had changed forever. Chapter 2. Safe Harbor. 3 days after a miracle, reality has a cruel way of crashing down like ice water on a dreamer's face, shattering every hope you dared to hold. Crystal Freeman stood in the doorway of her small apartment, baby Zara sleeping peacefully in her car seat, and stared at the note taped to her refrigerator. Stephen's handwriting was as careless as everything else about him, but the message was crystal clear. He'd cleaned out their joint account and disappeared. "Son of a bitch," she whispered, then immediately felt guilty for cursing in front of her newborn daughter. But what else could she call a man who'd abandoned his wife during labor and then robbed her while she recovered in the hospital? The apartment felt smaller and shabbier than ever. The second-hand furniture that had seemed cozy when Stephen was contributing to rent now looked pathetic in the harsh afternoon light. Bills were scattered across the kitchen table like fallen leaves, hospital costs, rent, utilities, all demanding money she didn't have. Crystal's hands shook as she opened the refrigerator, finding nothing but a carton of milk that was 3 days past expiration and some leftover Chinese takeout that smelled questionable. She had maybe $40 in her wallet, a maxed-out credit card, and a baby who would need formula soon since breastfeeding wasn't working as well as she'd hoped. "What am I going to do, baby girl?" she murmured to Zara, who stirred slightly but remained blissfully unaware that her world had just collapsed. The knock on her door made Crystal jump. Through the peephole, she saw her friend and colleague Indy Wells holding what looked like a casserole dish and wearing an expression of determined optimism. "I know you're in there, Crystal Freeman," Indy called through the door. "And I brought food, so you better let me in before I eat all this lasagna myself." Despite everything, Crystal found herself smiling as she opened the door. Indy Wells was a force of nature, a petite woman with silver-streaked auburn hair and the kind of no-nonsense attitude that made her one of the best pediatric nurses at Seabrook General. She was also the closest thing Crystal had to family in this town. "You look like hell," Indy announced, pushing past Crystal into the apartment. "When's the last time you ate something that wasn't from a vending machine?" "Nice to see you too," Crystal replied, but she was grateful for the familiar comfort of Indy's blunt affection. "I'm fine, really. Just tired." Indy set the casserole on the counter and turned to study Crystal with experienced eyes. "Honey, I've been a nurse for 23 years. I can spot exhaustion, malnutrition, and desperation from across a parking lot. Now, where's that worthless husband of yours?" Crystal's composure cracked. The whole story came pouring out. Stephen's abandonment, the empty bank account, the mounting bills. Indy listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each revelation. "That spineless piece of garbage," Indy finally said when Crystal finished. "I should have known he'd pull something like this. Remember when you were having morning sickness and he complained about having to make his own coffee?" "I don't know what I'm going to do," Crystal admitted, sinking into one of her mismatched kitchen chairs. "I can't go back to work for at least 6 weeks, and even then, daycare costs almost as much as I make. The rent's due in 5 days, and I don't even have enough for baby formula." Indy was quiet for a moment, then her face lit up with sudden inspiration. "What about that man? The one who stayed with you during labor?" Crystal felt her cheeks warm at the memory. Brian Lockhart had been the bright spot in the worst night of her life, but she'd tried not to think about him too much. Men like him didn't involve themselves with women like her beyond a single moment of gallantry. What about him? Crystal asked carefully. Don't play dumb with me. The entire maternity ward is still talking about it. A millionaire shipping magnate personally delivered equipment during the storm, then stayed to help deliver a baby. That's not normal behavior, honey. That's a man who was moved by something special. He was just being kind, Crystal protested. He saw someone in trouble and helped. That's all. That's all. Indy raised an eyebrow. Crystal, I've worked in that hospital for over 2 decades. I've seen plenty of kind gestures. What I saw in that delivery room was something else entirely. That man looked at you like you hung the moon. Crystal shook her head. You're imagining things. He probably doesn't even remember my name. Only one way to find out, Indy said, with the kind of smile that usually meant trouble. You march yourself down to that fancy maritime office of his and thank him properly. Take the baby. Men like that love babies. And who knows, maybe he's got connections, could help you find work. I can't just show up at his office with my baby like some kind of charity case, Crystal said, horrified at the suggestion. Why not? You're not asking for charity. You're thanking someone who went above and beyond to help you. There's a difference. Before Crystal could protest further, Zara began to fuss in her car seat. Crystal lifted her daughter, marveling again at how perfect she was. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and the most beautiful dark eyes she'd ever seen. For this little girl, she would swallow her pride and do whatever was necessary. Maybe you're right, Crystal said slowly. I should thank him properly. An hour later, Crystal found herself standing outside the imposing glass and steel building that housed Lockhart Maritime. The company occupied the top 3 floors of Seabrook's most expensive office building, with panoramic views of the harbor where million-dollar yachts bobbed alongside working fishing boats. Crystal felt acutely aware of her second-hand jeans and worn sweater as she entered the marble lobby. The receptionist, a perfectly groomed woman who probably spent more on her manicure than Crystal had for groceries, looked up with polite but cool interest. I'm here to see Mr. Lockhart, Crystal said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. My name is Crystal Freeman. Do you have an appointment? The receptionist asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. No, but Mr. Lockhart is extremely busy. If you'd like to make an appointment, I can check his availability for next month. Crystal's heart sank. Of course it wouldn't be that simple. She was about to turn away when a familiar voice called her name. Crystal. She turned to see Brian Lockhart emerging from a private elevator, and her breath caught in her throat. In the hospital, she'd been too focused on survival to really process how devastatingly handsome he was. Now, seeing him in his element, a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly salary, his dark hair styled but not overly polished, those striking grey eyes focused entirely on her, she felt suddenly dizzy. I thought that was you, he said, crossing the lobby with quick, confident strides. How are you feeling? How's the baby? The receptionist's eyebrows shot up nearly to her hairline, clearly shocked that her boss not only knew this casually dressed woman, but seemed genuinely pleased to see her. We're both fine, Crystal managed, acutely aware that she was blushing. I just wanted to thank you properly for what you did. I know you didn't have to. May I? Brian gestured toward Zara, who was awake and alert in her carrier. Crystal nodded, and Brian gently lifted the baby, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he cradled her against his chest. Zara studied his face with serious concentration, then apparently decided he passed inspection because she made a small, contented sound. She's beautiful, Brian said softly, and something in his voice made Crystal's chest tighten. Absolutely perfect. What's her name? Zara, Crystal replied. It means princess and blooming flower. It suits her. Brian looked up from the baby to meet Crystal's eyes. She looks like her mother. The compliment hit Crystal unexpectedly, making her feel warm and flustered. She wasn't used to men looking at her the way Brian was looking at her now, like she was something precious and worth protecting. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't—" "You would have been fine," Brian interrupted gently. "You're stronger than you know, but I'm glad I could be there." They stood there for a moment, an odd little family tableau in the middle of the busy lobby. Crystal could feel curious eyes on them, but Brian seemed oblivious to the attention. He was completely focused on her and Zara, as if nothing else in the world mattered. "Listen," Brian said suddenly, as if coming to a decision. "I know this might sound presumptuous, but I could use some help. My personal assistant just quit to get married, and I'm drowning in administrative work. You mentioned in the hospital that you had business training before you went into nursing. Would you consider working for me?" Crystal's eyes widened. What? The job would involve managing my schedule, handling correspondence, organizing my personal affairs. It's legitimate work, well paid, and flexible enough that you could bring Zara with you when needed. Brian's voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes were intense. "I also have a small cottage on my estate that's currently empty. You could live there as part of the compensation package." Crystal stared at him, wondering if she was hallucinating. "You're offering me a job and a place to live, but you barely know me." "I know enough," Brian said simply. "I know you're intelligent, organized, and resourceful. I know you're a devoted mother who would do anything to protect her child. And I know you're too proud to accept charity, which is why I'm offering you employment, not a handout." "I don't understand why you're doing this," Crystal said, her voice barely above a whisper. Brian was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because 3 days ago, I watched you bring life into the world with more courage and grace than I've ever seen. Because you deserve better than whatever situation drove you to my office today, and because—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since that night." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Crystal felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she processed his words. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to women like her. "This isn't charity," Brian continued, his voice gentle but firm. "This is me offering a job to someone I believe can do it well. The cottage comes with the position. You'd be doing me a favor by accepting." Crystal looked down at Zara, who was still contentedly nestled in Brian's arms. Her daughter deserved security, safety, a future. Her pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Just until I get back on my feet," she said quietly. Brian smiled, and the warmth of it made Crystal's knees weak. "Just until you're ready for whatever comes next." Chapter 3. Learning to trust. 6 weeks can transform everything, especially when you discover that fairy tales might actually exist in the most unexpected corners of your shattered world. Crystal Freeman stood at the cottage window, watching morning mist rise from the harbour like ghostly fingers reaching toward the sky. The view still took her breath away after a month here. Sailboats dancing on crystalline water, seabirds wheeling overhead, and the distant lighthouse Brian said his great-grandfather built in 1892. The cottage was like something from a storybook. Whitewashed walls, exposed beams, a working fireplace, and windows flooding rooms with golden light. Small but perfect, with a nursery Brian had painted and furnished before she moved in. He'd claimed it was standard procedure, but Crystal had seen his eyes light up when he carried Zara into the completed room. "Good morning, beautiful girl," Crystal murmured to Zara, who sat in her bouncy seat, gurgling at dust motes dancing in sunbeams. At 6 weeks old, Zara was showing her personality. Curious, alert, fearless. She rarely cried, seeming to sense her mother needed peace as they adjusted to their new life. Crystal's phone buzzed. "Coffee in 10 minutes? I have those contract revisions you wanted to review." She smiled, typing back, "See you soon, Zara's demanding her morning Brian fix. It had become their routine. Brian appeared each morning around 7:30, carrying coffee and whatever pastry caught his eye at the bakery. They'd sit at her kitchen table, Zara holding court, while reviewing his schedule and discussing business. Crystal had been surprised how much she enjoyed the work. Managing Brian's affairs was like solving a complex puzzle, balancing obligations with commitments, streamlining complicated processes, organizing his life to give him more time for what mattered. She had natural talent for seeing big pictures while managing details. But honestly, work wasn't what made her heart race when she heard his footsteps each morning. It was Brian himself. How he made her feel like the most important person when he looked at her, his gentle way of talking to Zara, the quiet strength radiating from him like warmth from fire. The knock came precisely on time. Crystal opened the door to find Brian holding steaming cups and a bakery bag, dark hair mussed by morning breeze. He wore dark jeans and a grey sweater, making his eyes look like storm clouds. Saturday meant no formal meetings, just relaxed planning sessions that had become Crystal's favourite part of the week. "Morning," he said, smile soft and genuine. "I brought those cinnamon rolls you mentioned craving yesterday." "You're going to make me fat," Crystal replied, reaching for coffee and inhaling rich aroma gratefully. "You could use a few more pounds," Brian said matter-of-factly, following her inside. "You've been working too hard." True, Crystal had thrown herself into organizing Brian's life with intensity bordering obsession, partly to prove she deserved his trust, partly because staying busy kept her from thinking about how dramatically her circumstances had changed. 6 weeks ago, abandoned and broke, now living in a magazine-worthy cottage, working for a man treating her like a valued partner, slowly learning maybe she deserved good things. "Good morning, Princess Zara," Brian said, settling across from Crystal and tickling Zara's tiny feet. The baby rewarded him with a huge, gummy smile, making both adults laugh. "Ready for another exciting day watching your mama make your friend's life infinitely more organized?" "She's not the only one who's gotten attached," Crystal said without thinking, immediately blushing at her words' implications. Brian's hands stilled on Zara's feet, and when he looked up, something intense and unreadable filled his expression. "Is that so?" Air between them suddenly felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Crystal found herself caught in Brian's gaze, unable to look away, pulse hammering in her throat. This had been happening more lately, moments when careful professional boundaries seemed to dissolve, leaving them staring like they were the only two people in the world. "I mean," Crystal said quickly, breaking tension, "Zara has gotten attached to you. Obviously, she lights up whenever she sees you." "Just Zara?" Brian asked quietly, something vulnerable in his voice making Crystal's breath catch. Before she could answer, Zara made a loud, demanding noise, breaking the spell. Both adults immediately turned to the baby, but Crystal could feel Brian's unasked question hanging between them. "So," she said, pulling out her tablet and trying to restore professionalism, "let's talk about next week's schedule. You have the Port Authority meeting Tuesday and the Charity Gala Planning Committee Wednesday." Brian leaned back, accepting her subject change gracefully, but Crystal could tell he wasn't really focusing on schedules. His eyes kept drifting to her face, studying her with intensity, making her feel simultaneously thrilled and terrified. "Actually," he said, "I was hoping you might consider attending the gala with me, as my date." Crystal's tablet slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering onto the table. "Your date?" "The Seabrook Children's Hospital benefit, next Saturday. I always attend these things, and frankly, they're incredibly boring alone." "I thought maybe—" He trailed off, seeming suddenly uncertain. "Unless you'd rather not. I don't want to make you uncomfortable." Crystal stared at him, mind racing. A date, an actual date, to a gala with photographers and society people and women who probably spent more on single dresses than Crystal made monthly. "I don't have anything to wear to something like that," she said weakly. "That's easily solved," Brian replied. "There are plenty of shops." "I can't let you buy me a dress," Crystal interrupted. "That would be—" "What? Practical? Kind? The sort of thing friends do for each other?" Friends. The word stung more than it should have. Was that what they were? Because the way Brian looked at her sometimes, how her heart raced when he was near, how she'd started thinking about him constantly, none of that felt particularly friendly. "I don't know," Crystal said honestly. "This is all so new. 6 weeks ago I was married to someone else. Granted, someone who turned out to be a complete bastard, but still, I don't know how to navigate this." Brian reached across the table, covering her hand with his, the simple touch sending electricity shooting up her arm. "Then let's not navigate it. Let's just take it one day at a time. Come to the gala because I'd enjoy your company. Wear whatever makes you feel beautiful. Let me introduce you to people who might become friends. Let yourself have one night where you don't worry about anything except enjoying yourself." It sounded so simple when he put it that way. One night. One chance to step outside the safe little world she'd built in this cottage and see what else might be possible. "Okay," she heard herself say. "Yes, I'd like that." Brian's smile was radiant. "Really? Really? But I'm warning you, I have no idea how to act at fancy parties. I'll probably embarrass you." "Impossible," Brian said with such conviction Crystal almost believed him. "You could never embarrass me." They spent the rest of the morning going over Brian's schedule, but there was new undercurrent to their conversation, awareness that something had shifted between them. Crystal found herself noticing things she'd tried to ignore, how Brian's eyes crinkled when he laughed, the strength of his hands as he gestured. Around noon, Brian suggested they take Zara for a walk around the property. Crystal had been here for weeks, but focused on work, barely exploring beyond the cottage. Brian seemed delighted to play tour guide, pointing out buildings making up the Lockhart estate. "That's the original house," he said, gesturing toward a colonial overlooking the harbour. "Built in 1847 by my great-great-grandfather. My parents lived there until they died." "Where do you live?" Crystal asked. "Up there," he pointed toward a modern structure among trees on a hill. "I had it built 10 years ago. Wanted something that felt like home, not a museum." "It's beautiful," Crystal said, admiring clean lines and large windows. "Would you like to see it? I could make lunch, and Zara could nap in the guest room." Crystal hesitated. Going to Brian's house felt like crossing a line, moving from professional territory into something more personal. But looking at his hopeful face, she nodded. "I'd like that." Brian's house was luxurious. High ceilings, hardwood floors, windows offering stunning water views, but also warm, filled with comfortable furniture and family photographs. "This is where the magic happens," Brian said, leading her into a spacious kitchen. "I'm not much of a cook, but I make a mean grilled cheese." As Brian moved around the kitchen, Crystal studied photographs covering one wall. Family pictures, younger Brian with an older couple who must have been his parents. "You look like your father," Crystal observed. "Everyone says that," Brian replied, "but I hope I'm more like my mother. She understood people. Dad was brilliant with business, but never figured out how to connect with individuals." "What happened to them?" Brian was quiet for a long moment. "Sailing accident when I was 22, caught in a sudden storm 50 miles offshore. The boat was found, but they never were." "I'm so sorry," Crystal said, heart aching for pain in his voice. "The hardest part was we'd had an argument before they left. Something stupid about me wanting to take a year off to travel instead of going straight into the family business. The last words I said to my father were pretty harsh." Crystal crossed to where Brian stood, placing her hand gently on his arm. "They knew you loved them." Did they? Brian turned to look at her, vulnerability in his eyes. Because I'm not sure I ever told them. I was so focused on proving I was my own man that I never just said the words. You were 22, Crystal said softly. 22-year-olds are supposed to fight with their parents. It's how you figure out who you are. They understood that. Brian covered her hand with his, and they stood there connected by grief and understanding, and something deeper that neither was quite ready to name, D from somewhere. She was continually amazed by how prepared he always seemed for her daughter's needs. As Brian moved around the kitchen, Crystal found herself studying photographs covering one wall. Most were boats and harbours, but family pictures too. Younger Brian with an older couple who must have been his parents, various group shots from company events or social gatherings. You look like your father, Crystal observed, pointing to a formal portrait of a distinguished man in naval uniform. Everyone says that, Brian replied, pausing in sandwich preparation. But I hope I'm more like my mother. She was the one who actually understood people. Dad was brilliant with business, but never quite figured out how to connect with individuals. What happened to them? Crystal asked gently. Brian was quiet for a long moment, focusing intently on buttering bread. Sailing accident when I was 22. They were caught in a sudden storm about 50 miles offshore. The boat was found, but they never were. I'm so sorry, Crystal said, her heart aching for pain she could hear in his voice. It was a long time ago, Brian said, but his hands had stilled. The hardest part was that we'd had an argument before they left. Something stupid about me wanting to take a year off to travel instead of going straight into the family business. The last words I said to my father were pretty harsh. Crystal stood and crossed to where Brian was standing, placing her hand gently on his arm. They knew you loved them. Did they? Brian turned to look at her, and Crystal was startled by vulnerability in his eyes. Because I'm not sure I ever told them. I was so focused on proving I was my own man, on establishing independence, that I never just said the words. You were 22, Crystal said softly. 22-year-olds are supposed to fight with their parents. It's how you figure out who you are. They understood that. Brian covered her hand with his, and they stood there in his kitchen, connected by grief and understanding, and something deeper that neither was quite ready to name. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities and the growing certainty that whatever was happening between them was far more than either had bargained for. Chapter 4. Storms Approaching. Sometimes the most dangerous storms are the ones that come from the people you thought you'd left behind forever, carrying destruction disguised as salvation. Crystal was humming softly as she organized Brian's home office. Zara content in her bouncy seat nearby, when the knock on the cottage door shattered the peaceful morning like glass. It wasn't Brian's familiar respectful tap or Indy's cheerful rat-a-tat. This was aggressive, demanding, and somehow familiar in a way that made Crystal's blood run cold. Through the peephole, she saw a face she'd hoped never to see again. Stephen Higgins stood on her porch, hair disheveled, clothes wrinkled, expression a mixture of desperation and entitlement. She remembered all too well. "Crystal," he called through the door. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." Crystal's first instinct was to pretend she wasn't home, but Zara chose that moment to let out a happy gurgle that carried clearly through the thin door. Stephen's pounding became more insistent. "Open the door, Crystal." "I'm not leaving until we talk." With trembling hands, Crystal opened the door but kept the chain lock engaged, creating only a small gap. "What do you want, Stephen?" He looked terrible. His face was thinner than she remembered, eyes bloodshot and desperate. He'd always been handsome in a superficial way, but now he looked like a man who'd been living rough for weeks. "I want to come home," he said without preamble. "I made a mistake, okay? I panicked. The whole birth thing freaked me out, and I wasn't thinking clearly. But I'm ready now. I want my family back." Crystal stared at him in disbelief. Are you serious? You abandoned me during labor, stole our money, and disappeared for 2 months, and now you think you can just show up and everything will be fine? I was scared, Stephen said, voice taking on the wheedling tone she remembered from every time he'd tried to talk his way out of trouble. You have to understand, Crystal. Seeing you in pain, all that blood, the possibility that something could go wrong, it was too much. I needed time to process. You needed time to process, Crystal repeated flatly, while I was alone, broke, and caring for a newborn. But you weren't alone, were you? Stephen's expression turned ugly. I heard about your sugar daddy. The whole town's talking about how Crystal Freeman landed herself a millionaire. How long after I left did you start spreading your legs for Brian Lockhart? Crystal's temper flared white-hot. Get off my property. Now! This isn't your property, Stephen sneered. This is his property. You're just the live-in whore, aren't you? Playing house until he gets bored and kicks you out. That's enough. Crystal started to close the door, but Stephen shoved his shoulder against it, the chain lock straining under pressure. You think he's going to marry you? Stephen laughed, the sound bitter and cruel. Men like that don't marry women like you, Crystal. They use them and throw them away. At least I offered you a ring. A ring and a lifetime of disappointment, Crystal shot back. I'd rather be alone than with someone who runs away the moment things get difficult. I'm here now, Stephen said, voice becoming desperate again. I'm ready to be a father. I want to see my daughter. Your daughter? Crystal's voice rose. You mean the daughter you abandoned? The daughter whose birth certificate doesn't have your name on it because you weren't there to sign it? Stephen's face darkened. She's my blood, Crystal, my legal right. And I think any judge would be very interested to hear about your current living arrangements. A single mother shacking up with a man she barely knows, living in sin, exposing her innocent child to God knows what kind of immoral behavior. Crystal felt ice form in her veins. You wouldn't. Try me, Stephen said coldly. I've already talked to a lawyer. My mother's paying for it. She's very concerned about her granddaughter being raised in such an unsuitable environment. Before Crystal could respond, the sound of a car engine made them both turn. Brian's black Mercedes was coming up the drive, moving faster than usual. Crystal had never been so relieved to see anyone in her life. Brian parked and got out with controlled grace, but Crystal could see tension in his shoulders, the set of his jaw. He'd clearly recognized Stephen's car in the driveway. Is there a problem here? Brian asked, voice deceptively calm as he approached the cottage. No problem, Stephen said, but he stepped back from the door. Just a husband trying to reconcile with his wife. Ex-husband, Crystal corrected sharply. The divorce papers were filed last week. Brian moved to stand beside the door, close enough that Crystal could feel his solid presence through the gap. His proximity made her feel immediately safer, stronger. I think it's time for you to leave, Brian said quietly, but there was steel underneath the politeness. Stephen looked between them, expression turning vicious. This is perfect. The whole happy family together. Tell me, Lockhart, does she scream your name the way she used to scream mine? Brian went very still, and Crystal saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. For a moment, she thought he might actually hit Stephen, and part of her wished he would. You have 10 seconds to get in your car and drive away, Brian said, voice deadly quiet. Or I'll call the police and have you arrested for trespassing and harassment. You can't keep me from my daughter forever, Stephen said, but he was already backing toward his car. I have rights, legal rights, and my mother has connections. Judges, lawyers, people who matter in this town, people who don't appreciate outsiders coming in and disrupting good families. Your family was disrupted the moment you walked away from it, Brian replied. And if you ever threaten Crystal or Zara again, you'll discover just how many connections I have in this town. Stephen got into his car, but he rolled down the window as he started the engine. "This isn't over, Crystal. Think about what I said. Think about what's best for Zara. Is growing up as the bastard child of a rich man's whore really the life you want for her?" He drove away, leaving gravel spraying and the acrid smell of burned rubber in the air. Crystal realized she was shaking, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. Brian immediately stepped closer, reaching through the gap to touch her hand. "Crystal, let me in, please." With numb fingers, Crystal unhooked the chain and opened the door. Brian was inside in an instant, pulling her into his arms, holding her against his chest while she tried to stop trembling. "He can't take her," Crystal whispered against Brian's shirt. "Can he? I mean, legally he doesn't have any rights, does he?" Brian's arms tightened around her. "We'll make sure he doesn't. I'll call my lawyer today. But Crystal, why didn't you tell me about the divorce papers?" "I didn't want you to think—" Crystal pulled back to look at him. "I didn't want you to think I was using you to get out of my marriage. The divorce was something I had to do for myself, not for us." "For us," Brian repeated softly. I like the sound of that. Despite everything, Crystal found herself smiling. "Yeah? Yeah." Brian cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "But I need you to promise me something. No more keeping important things to yourself. We're in this together now, which means we face problems together." "Together?" Crystal agreed, the word feeling like a promise. From her bouncy seat, Zara made a small fussing sound, as if sensing the tension in the room. Brian immediately went to her, lifting her gently and holding her against his shoulder. "It's okay, princess," he murmured, voice soft and soothing. "No one's going to hurt you or your mama. I promise." Watching him with Zara, Crystal felt her heart swell with an emotion she wasn't quite ready to name. This man who'd walked into her life like a guardian angel, who'd given her safety and hope and the chance to dream again. How had she gotten so lucky? But Stephen's words echoed in her mind, poisonous and persistent. What if he was right? What if being with Brian made things worse for her in a custody fight? What if her relationship with Brian was exactly the kind of ammunition Stephen needed to take Zara away from her? The thought made her stomach clench with terror. She'd rather die than lose her daughter, and if that meant walking away from the best thing that had ever happened to her, then maybe that's what she'd have to do. Chapter 5. Battle Lines War has a way of revealing exactly who stands with you when the world turns dark and who disappears into shadows the moment things become difficult. The manila envelope arrived on a grey Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who barely looked old enough to drive, let alone destroy someone's life. Crystal signed for it with trembling hands, already knowing what it contained before she tore it open in the privacy of her cottage kitchen. "Petition for emergency custody hearing," she read aloud, voice hollow in the sudden silence. "Higgins versus Freeman." The papers detailed Stephen's claims in cold, clinical language that made Crystal's stomach turn. He painted himself as a reformed man who'd made mistakes but was now ready to take responsibility for his daughter. Meanwhile, Crystal was portrayed as an unstable woman who'd shacked up with a wealthy man mere weeks after giving birth, creating an inappropriate and potentially dangerous environment for an innocent child. The worst part was how some of it sounded almost reasonable when stripped of context. Yes, she was living on Brian's property. Yes, their relationship had developed quickly. Yes, she was dependent on him financially. When presented without the full story, Stephen's abandonment, Brian's kindness, the genuine love that had grown between them, it could look exactly like what Stephen was claiming it was. Crystal was still staring at the papers when Brian arrived for their morning coffee, taking one look at her face and immediately crossing to her side. "What is it?" he asked. then saw the legal documents scattered across the table. His expression darkened as he read, jaw tightening with each paragraph. "Emergency hearing," he said grimly. "He's not wasting any time." 3 weeks, Crystal whispered. 3 weeks to prove I'm not a terrible mother who's unfit to raise her own child. Brian pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she fought back tears. "We'll fight this," he said firmly. "My lawyers are already preparing. This is just Stephen's opening move, not his winning one." "What if they believe him?" Crystal asked against Brian's chest. "What if the judge thinks he's right, that I'm some kind of gold digger who's putting her own selfish desires before her child's welfare?" "Then the judge would be wrong," Brian said simply. "And we'll prove it." The sound of a car in the driveway made them both look up. Through the window, Crystal saw a sleek black Audi pulling up beside Brian's Mercedes. A woman emerged from the driver's seat, tall, blonde, impeccably dressed in the kind of effortless elegance that money could buy. "Who is that?" Crystal asked, though something about the woman's confident stride toward the cottage made her stomach clench with dread. Brian's expression had gone carefully neutral. "That would be Ivy Lane, my former fiancée." Crystal felt the blood drain from her face. "Your former fiancée? The one you didn't mention you had?" "It ended 3 years ago," Brian said quickly. "I have no idea why she's here." Ivy's knock was crisp and authoritative. Brian opened the door, body language tense as he faced the woman who'd once planned to marry him. "Hello, Brian," Ivy said, voice cultured and smooth. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." She was beautiful in the way that only serious money could create. Perfect blonde hair that probably cost more to maintain than Crystal made in a month, flawless skin, designer clothes that fit like they'd been made specifically for her body, which they probably had been. "What do you want, Ivy?" Brian asked without inviting her in. "I heard about your situation," Ivy said, gaze moving past Brian to where Crystal stood holding Zara. "I thought you might appreciate some friendly advice." "I don't need advice," Brian replied coolly. "Perhaps not, but she might." Ivy's smile was razor-sharp as she focused on Crystal. "You must be Crystal. I've heard so much about you." Crystal lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated despite feeling completely outclassed. "All good things, I hope." Ivy laughed, the sound like expensive crystal breaking. "Oh, my dear, I'm sure you're lovely. But love and suitability aren't always the same thing, are they?" "What's that supposed to mean?" Crystal asked, though she was beginning to understand exactly what this woman was doing here. "I've been in Europe for the past few months," Ivy continued, stepping into the cottage without invitation. "But news travels, even across the Atlantic. Brian Lockhart, one of Seabrook's most eligible bachelors, involved with a woman who's still technically married to another man. A woman with a newborn baby and financial problems. The timing is unfortunate." "The timing is perfect," Brian said firmly, moving to stand beside Crystal. "And my personal life is none of your concern." "Of course it is," Ivy replied, examining the cottage's modest interior with barely concealed disdain. "Your reputation affects the entire social fabric of this community, and right now people are talking." "Let them talk," Crystal said, finding her voice despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Oh, I'm sure you'd like that," Ivy said, with false sweetness. "But Brian's reputation is built on more than just money, dear. It's built on respectability, on making appropriate choices, on understanding the social dynamics that keep communities like this functioning." She turned back to Brian, expression becoming more serious. "There's going to be a custody hearing. The entire town will be watching to see how this plays out. Do you really want to be associated with that kind of drama?" "The drama wasn't created by Crystal," Brian said coldly. "It was created by her ex-husband, who abandoned his family and is now trying to manipulate the situation for his own gain." "Perhaps," Ivy said, "but the optics are terrible. A wealthy man, a poor single mother, a custody battle that will inevitably involve questions about morality and appropriate behavior. It's going to be messy, Brian. Very messy. Crystal felt sick. Everything Ivy was saying echoed her own worst fears about how this situation might be perceived. "What do you want, Ivy?" Brian asked again, patience clearly wearing thin. "I want to help," Ivy said smoothly. "Both of you. Crystal, you clearly care about Brian, and you certainly don't want to see his reputation damaged because of your circumstances. The solution is simple. Step back. Let Brian provide for you and your daughter financially if he insists, but don't drag him into a public custody battle that could damage everything he's worked to build." "You want me to leave him," Crystal said flatly. "I want you to do what's best for everyone involved," Ivy corrected, "including your daughter. Do you really want her growing up with the shadow of this scandal hanging over her? With people always whispering about how her mother trapped a wealthy man?" "That's enough," Brian said sharply. "Crystal isn't trapping anyone, and she's not going anywhere." Ivy sighed as if dealing with particularly stubborn children. "Brian, be reasonable. You've known this woman for what, 2 months? And in that time, she's gone from being a married pregnant woman to a divorced single mother living in your cottage. The progression is rapid." "The progression is none of your business," Brian replied. "Everything about you is my business," Ivy said, mask of politeness finally slipping. "Do you think 3 years together meant nothing? Do you think I'm going to stand by and watch you destroy yourself over some infatuation with a woman who needs rescuing?" "I don't need rescuing," Crystal said quietly, but her voice carried steel. "And I'm not an infatuation." Ivy turned to her with genuine curiosity. "Aren't you? Tell me, Crystal, what exactly do you bring to this relationship besides problems? Besides the need for financial support and legal protection?" The question hit Crystal like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it voiced the doubts that had been whispering in the back of her mind since Stephen's visit. "I bring love," Crystal said simply. "I bring honesty and loyalty and the kind of devotion that doesn't disappear the moment things get difficult." "How refreshing," Ivy said dryly. "And what happens when the novelty wears off? When Brian realizes that love doesn't compensate for social incompatibility? When the custody battle gets ugly and expensive and embarrassing? When people start avoiding him because his association with you makes them uncomfortable?" "That won't happen," Brian said firmly, but Crystal could hear uncertainty underneath his confidence. "Won't it?" Ivy challenged. "You're already being talked about, Brian. The Palmers cancelled their dinner invitation last week. The Hendersons didn't invite you to their anniversary party. People are watching this situation, waiting to see how it plays out." Crystal felt the walls closing in around her. She'd known this was too good to be true, had known that fairy tales didn't happen to women like her. But she'd allowed herself to hope anyway, and now that hope was being systematically dismantled by a woman who clearly knew exactly which buttons to push. "I should go," Crystal said quietly, voice barely audible. "What?" Brian turned to her in shock. "Crystal, no, don't let her get to you." "She's right," Crystal said, tears burning her eyes. "About all of it. The timing, the optics, the way this must look to everyone else. I'm going to damage your reputation, your business, your entire life." "You're not damaging anything," Brian said desperately. "Ivy doesn't speak for this community, and she certainly doesn't speak for me." But Crystal could see it in his eyes, the first seeds of doubt that Ivy had planted, and she knew that once those seeds took root, they would grow until they choked out everything beautiful between them. The battle lines had been drawn, and Crystal was beginning to realize she might be fighting a war she couldn't win. Chapter 6. Into the Storm. Sometimes, the only way to discover what you're truly fighting for is to risk losing everything, including your own life. 3 weeks had passed since Ivy's visit, and Crystal felt like she was suffocating. She'd moved back to her cottage and stopped working for Brian, though she remained on his property for Zara's sake. She was avoiding him completely, and Brian was devastated but respecting her choice. The distance between them felt like an ocean neither knew how to cross. The weather matched Crystal's mood, grey, oppressive, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen. The local news had been warning about a massive storm system approaching Seabrook, possibly the worst in decades. Most residents were battening down the hatches, stocking up on supplies and preparing to ride it out. But as Crystal stood at her cottage window, watching the first drops of rain begin to fall, her mind wasn't on the weather. It was on the custody hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning. Stephen's lawyer had been relentless, painting her as an unfit mother living an immoral lifestyle. Meanwhile, Brian's legal team had worked tirelessly to defend her, but Crystal could see the strain it was putting on him. Ivy's words echoed in her mind constantly. When people start avoiding him because his association with you makes them uncomfortable. And it was true. Crystal had noticed the way some of Brian's business associates had grown distant, the invitations that had stopped coming, the whispered conversations that ceased when she entered a room. She was destroying the man she loved, and she didn't know how to stop it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Indy. "Storm's getting bad. You and Zara should come stay with me tonight." Crystal looked down at Zara, who was sleeping peacefully in her crib, oblivious to the chaos surrounding her young life. Maybe Indy was right. Maybe it would be safer to leave the cottage, to put some distance between herself and Brian before she caused him any more damage. But before she could respond, another text appeared, this one from Nova, Brian's estate manager. "Crystal, I'm worried about Brian. He took his sailboat out an hour ago despite the storm warnings. He's not answering his radio." Crystal's blood turned to ice. She ran to the window facing the harbour and could barely make out a small shape on the churning water through the sheets of rain. Brian's sailboat was out there, getting battered by waves that seemed to grow larger by the minute. "No, no, no," Crystal whispered, grabbing her phone and dialing Brian's number. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again and again, panic rising in her throat like bile. This was her fault. Brian was out there in that storm because of her, because she'd pushed him away, because she'd let Ivy's poisonous words convince her that loving him was selfish. And now he might die because she'd been too much of a coward to fight for what they had. Crystal didn't hesitate. She bundled Zara into her car seat, grabbed her keys, and ran through the driving rain to her car. She had to get to the marina, had to do something to help bring Brian home. The harbour was chaos. Coast Guard boats were preparing to launch rescue operations, and Crystal could see Nova coordinating with the maritime authorities. The older woman's face was pale with worry as she spotted Crystal running toward them with Zara. "Any word?" Crystal shouted over the howling wind. "He's not responding to radio calls," Nova shouted back. "The Coast Guard is going out to look for him, but in this weather—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew how dangerous the conditions were. Crystal stared out at the harbour, trying to spot Brian's boat through the storm, her heart hammering against her ribs. "This is my fault," she said, the words torn away by the wind. "What?" Nova leaned closer to hear her. "This is my fault," Crystal repeated louder. "He's out there because of me, because I've been avoiding him, because I let that bitch Ivy convince me that I was bad for him." Nova's expression softened, despite the chaos around them. "Honey, Brian makes his own choices. He's been sailing these waters since he was a boy. He knows what he's doing." But Crystal could see the worry in the older woman's eyes, could hear the doubt in her voice. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and even experienced sailors could be overwhelmed by nature's fury. A Coast Guard officer approached them, his face grim. "We've spotted a sailboat about 3 miles out, but we can't tell if it's his. The visibility is too poor. We're launching a rescue boat now." Crystal watched the Coast Guard vessel disappear into the storm, feeling helpless and terrified. She should be out there with them. She should be doing something other than standing on the dock while the man she loved fought for his life. I need to radio him, she said suddenly, turning to Nova. Can I use the maritime radio in Brian's office? Nova nodded, leading Crystal and Zara quickly to the harbour master's building, where Brian kept a small office. The radio crackled with static and emergency communications, but Crystal managed to find the right frequency. Brian, this is Crystal, she said into the microphone, her voice shaking. Please respond. Please come home. Static. She tried again. Brian, I know you can hear me. I know you're angry and hurt, and I know this is my fault. But please, please don't do this. Zara needs you. I need you. More static, but then, faintly, a voice broke through the interference. Crystal? Brian's voice was barely audible over the storm noise, but it was him. Brian, oh thank God. Are you okay? Where are you? About 2 miles southeast of the harbour, he replied, his voice strained. Boats taking on water. Engines out. I'm trying to get back on sail power alone, but the wind... The radio cut out, leaving only static. Crystal felt her world tilt on its axis. He was in real danger out there, and it was because of her, because she'd pushed him away instead of fighting for their love. Brian, she called into the radio. Brian, can you hear me? Nothing but static for several long minutes, and then his voice came through again, weaker this time. Crystal, I need you to know something, in case I don't make it back. Don't you dare, Crystal said fiercely. Don't you dare talk like that. You're coming home. You're coming home to us. I love you. Brian's voice crackled through the static. I love you and Zara more than my own life. I went out here because I couldn't stand the thought of losing you, of watching you slip away because of what other people think. Crystal was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she gripped the radio microphone. I love you too. I've been an idiot. I let Ivy get into my head, let her convince me that I wasn't good enough for you. But I don't care what anyone thinks anymore. I just want you to come home. The Coast Guard is coming for you, she continued. Just hold on. Please, just hold on. Crystal, Brian's voice was getting fainter. If something happens to me, I want you to know that these past few months with you and Zara have been the best of my life. You didn't ruin anything. You saved me. You saved me first, Crystal whispered, but she wasn't sure if he could hear her anymore. The radio went dead. Crystal stared at it for a moment, then handed Zara to Nova and ran back outside into the storm. She could see lights in the distance, the Coast Guard vessels searching the churning waters. Other boats had joined the search despite the dangerous conditions. The entire maritime community was looking for Brian. Crystal stood on the dock, rain soaking through her clothes, wind whipping her hair across her face, and she prayed harder than she'd ever prayed in her life. She prayed to whoever might be listening that Brian would make it home safely. She prayed that she'd get the chance to tell him how much he meant to her, how sorry she was for pushing him away, how ready she was to fight for their love no matter what anyone else thought. In the distance, she saw a light, a faint beacon cutting through the storm. It was getting closer, and Crystal held her breath as the shape of a boat became visible through the rain and spray. It was the Coast Guard vessel, and they were towing something behind them, a sailboat, Brian's sailboat. Crystal ran toward the approaching boats, her heart in her throat. Was he alive? Was he hurt? She couldn't see clearly through the storm, but as the boats drew closer to the dock, she could make out a figure sitting in the Coast Guard vessel. Brian. He was wrapped in a blanket, clearly exhausted and probably hypothermic, but he was alive. He was alive, and he was coming home. As soon as the Coast Guard boat tied up to the dock, Crystal was there, not caring about protocol or safety. Brian looked up and saw her, and despite his exhausted state, his face lit up with relief and love. "Crystal," he said, his voice hoarse. "You idiot!" she said, launching herself into his arms despite the Coast Guard officer's protests about medical checks. "You absolute idiot! Don't you ever scare me like that again?" Brian held her tight, and Crystal could feel him shaking, from cold, from exhaustion, from emotion. I'm sorry, he whispered against her hair. I'm so sorry. I just couldn't stand the thought of losing you. You're not going to lose me, Crystal said fiercely. I don't care what Ivy thinks, or what the town thinks, or what anyone thinks. I'm not going anywhere. We're going to fight this custody battle together, and we're going to win, and we're going to build the life we want, regardless of what anyone else says. Brian pulled back to look at her, his grey eyes intense despite his exhaustion. Are you sure? Because it's going to be hard. Stephen and his lawyers aren't going to give up easily. I'm sure, Crystal said without hesitation. I love you, Brian Lockhart, and I'm done being afraid of that. As the paramedics checked Brian over and Nova fussed over Zara, Crystal stood on the dock watching the storm begin to calm. The worst of it had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh with possibility. Tomorrow they would face the custody hearing. Tomorrow they would stand together in front of a judge and fight for their right to be a family. And whatever happened, they would face it together, because some things were worth fighting for, and their love was definitely one of them. Chapter 7. Truth in the Tempest. Sometimes it takes almost losing everything to realize that the truth was right there all along, waiting for you to be brave enough to claim it. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors and the soft sound of rain against the windows. Brian lay in the narrow bed, looking pale but alert, his storm-grey eyes never leaving Crystal's face as she sat beside him holding Zara. The baby was sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded just hours before. The doctor says you're lucky, Crystal said softly, reaching out to brush a strand of dark hair from Brian's forehead. Mild hypothermia, some bruising but nothing serious. You could have died out there. But I didn't, Brian replied, catching her hand and holding it against his cheek. I came home. To you. The simple words made Crystal's heart clench with emotion. After weeks of pushing him away, of convincing herself that she was bad for him, hearing him say that she was home felt like a miracle. Brian, I need to tell you something, she began, but he shook his head. Let me go first, he said, struggling to sit up straighter in the hospital bed. I've had a lot of time to think out there on the water, and there are things I need to say. Crystal nodded, settling back in her chair with Zara still sleeping in her arms. When I took the boat out today, I wasn't trying to hurt myself, Brian said, his voice earnest. I want you to know that. I needed to think, to figure out how to fight for us without making things worse for you, but the storm came up faster than I expected, and by the time I realized how dangerous it was, I was too far out to get back safely. You scared me to death, Crystal whispered. When Nova told me you were out there, I thought I'd lost you forever. You'll never lose me, Brian said with such conviction that Crystal almost believed him. Crystal, I love you. Not just because you're beautiful, not just because you need protecting, but because you make me a better man. You make me want to be worthy of the love you give so freely. Tears were sliding down Crystal's cheeks now, but she didn't try to stop them. I love you too. So much it terrifies me. But Brian, Ivy was right about some things. I am causing problems for you. People are talking and your business relationships are suffering and— Stop, Brian interrupted gently. Ivy was wrong about everything that matters. Yes, some people are talking. Yes, some of my so-called friends have shown their true colors. But you know what I realized out there in the storm? I don't care. I don't care what they think, what they say, or whether they approve of my choices. He struggled to sit up fully, his eyes intense as they met hers. My parents died without knowing how much I loved them because I was too proud to say the words. I'm not making that mistake again. I love you, Crystal Freeman. I love your strength, your courage, your fierce devotion to Zara. I love the way you organize my chaos and the way you make me laugh. I love that you see me as a man, not just a bank account. But the custody hearing is tomorrow, Crystal said, her voice breaking. What if the judge thinks— Then we'll deal with whatever the judge thinks, Brian said firmly. Together. But I want you to know something else. I've made a decision. Crystal's heart stuttered. What kind of decision? Brian reached into the drawer of his bedside table and pulled out a small velvet box. Crystal's breath caught in her throat as he opened it to reveal a stunning diamond ring that caught the light from the hospital room's fluorescent bulbs. I bought this 3 weeks ago, Brian said quietly, right after Ivy's visit, when I saw how much her words had hurt you. I was going to wait, to propose properly once all this legal stuff was settled. But almost dying tonight made me realize that waiting for the perfect moment is just another way of being afraid. He took Crystal's free hand in his thumb stroking gently across her knuckles. Crystal Freeman, will you marry me? Not because it would help with the custody case, not because it would solve our problems, but because I love you with everything I am and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it to you. Crystal stared at him, her mind reeling. A proposal. He was proposing to her in a hospital room while she held her baby daughter, both of them probably looking like drowned rats from the storm. It was nothing like the fairy tale proposals she'd dreamed of as a little girl. It was perfect. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Brian. Yes, I'll marry you. Brian's smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made just for her, which, knowing Brian, it probably had been. How did you know my size? She asked, admiring the way the diamond caught the light. I may have borrowed one of your other rings and had it sized, Brian admitted with a sheepish grin. Nova helped. She's been in on this from the beginning. Crystal laughed, despite her tears. Of course she has. That woman doesn't miss anything. She also wants me to tell you that you're an idiot for thinking you're not good enough for me, Brian said, his expression becoming serious again. Her exact words were, that girl is the best thing that ever happened to you, and if you let her slip away because you're too proud to fight for her, I'll box your ears myself. I love Nova, Crystal said, meaning it completely. She loves you too. We all do. Me, Nova, Indy, even the guys at the marina. You've become part of our family, Crystal, and families stick together no matter what. Crystal felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling of belonging she'd never experienced before. Even with Stephen, she'd always felt like she was trying to fit into a life that wasn't quite right for her. But with Brian, with this chosen family of people who cared about her, she felt truly at home for the first time in her life. About tomorrow, she began, but Brian shook his head. Tomorrow we're going to walk into that courtroom together, he said firmly. We're going to tell the truth about our relationship, about Stephen's abandonment, about the kind of life we want to build for Zara, and whatever the judge decides, we'll face it as a family. But what if... No what ifs, Brian interrupted. I learned something important out there tonight. Life is unpredictable and sometimes dangerous, but the biggest risk isn't living boldly. The biggest risk is letting fear keep you from grabbing hold of happiness when it's right in front of you. He reached out to stroke Zara's soft cheek with one finger. The baby stirred slightly, but didn't wake, her tiny hand closing around Brian's finger in her sleep. Look at her, Brian said softly. She's not afraid. She doesn't know that some people think her mother isn't good enough, or that her father abandoned her, or that the world can be cruel and unfair. All she knows is that she's loved and safe and cared for. That's what we're going to give her, a life where love matters more than what other people think. Crystal looked down at her daughter, then at the man who'd walked into their lives like a guardian angel and refused to leave even when things got complicated. The ring on her finger caught the light again, a tangible symbol of the promise they were making to each other. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. I'm scared too, Brian said, but I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you. A soft knock on the door interrupted them. Nova peeked in, her weathered face creasing with relief when she saw Brian sitting up and alert. "How are you feeling, you reckless fool?" she asked, bustling into the room with the familiarity of someone who'd been part of the family for decades. "Better now," Brian said, gesturing to where Crystal's hand rested in his, the diamond glinting on her finger. Nova's eyes widened, then her face broke into a huge grin. "Well, it's about time. I was beginning to think you'd never work up the courage to ask her properly." "You knew he was going to propose?" Crystal asked. "Honey, I helped him pick out the ring," Nova said with a laugh. "That boy's been carrying it around in his pocket for weeks, working up the nerve. I told him he better ask you soon before you came to your senses, and ran off with someone who deserved you." "I deserve her," Brian said quietly, his eyes never leaving Crystal's face. "Maybe I didn't before, but I'm going to spend every day of the rest of my life earning the right to call her mine." "Damn right you will," Nova said approvingly. "Now, the doctor says you can go home in a few hours if your temperature stays stable. I've got the cottage ready for you, Crystal, and I took the liberty of calling Indy to let her know everyone's safe." "Thank you," Crystal said, feeling overwhelmed by the kindness of these people who'd welcomed her into their lives without reservation. "No thanks necessary," Nova replied. "We're family now. That's what family does." As Nova bustled out to handle discharge paperwork, Crystal and Brian sat in comfortable silence, watching Zara sleep and processing everything that had happened. The storm was finally passing, leaving the air clean and fresh with possibility. Tomorrow would bring the custody hearing, and with it all the uncertainty and stress they'd been dreading. But tonight, in this quiet hospital room, Crystal felt nothing but peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, and that made all the difference in the world. Chapter 8. Fighting for Family. Some battles are fought in courtrooms with words as weapons, where the stakes are measured not in money, but in love, hope, and the future of an innocent child. The courthouse steps were slick with morning dew as Crystal and Brian approached the imposing brick building that would determine Zara's fate. Crystal clutched Brian's hand tightly, the engagement ring on her finger catching the early sunlight like a beacon of hope. Zara was with Nova, safely away from the legal battlefield that awaited inside. "Remember," Brian murmured as they climbed the steps, "we tell the truth, all of it. Stephen's abandonment, our love story, our plans for the future. The truth is on our side." Crystal nodded, though her stomach was twisted in knots. She wore her best dress, a navy blue sheath that Brian had insisted on buying for her, saying she needed armor for this battle. Her hair was pulled back in a professional chignon, and she'd applied makeup carefully to hide the shadows under her eyes from a sleepless night. Inside the courthouse, they were directed to Family Courtroom B. Crystal's heart sank when she saw Stephen sitting at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit. Stephen had cleaned up for court, hairstyled, wearing what looked like a new suit, projecting an image of respectability that Crystal knew was completely false. Beside him sat his mother, Mira Higgins, a bitter-looking woman with steel-grey hair and disapproving eyes. She looked at Crystal with unconcealed disdain, as if she were something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. Brian's legal team was already seated at the defendant's table, 3 lawyers who looked competent and determined. The lead attorney, Sarah Martinez, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a reputation for fighting hard for her clients. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked quietly as Crystal and Brian took their seats. "Terrified," Crystal admitted. "Good," Sarah said with a slight smile. "It means you understand what's at stake. But remember, Stephen has to prove you're an unfit mother. All we have to do is show that you're not. And from what I've seen, that won't be difficult." The bailiff called for all to rise as Judge Patricia Henley entered the courtroom. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and an expression that gave nothing away. Crystal had researched her extensively. Judge Henley had a reputation for being fair but tough, with little patience for games or theatrics. "Be seated," Judge Henley said, settling behind her bench. "We're here today for an emergency custody hearing in the matter of Higgins versus Freeman. I've reviewed the preliminary filings, and I have to say this is an unusual case." Stephen's lawyer stood immediately. "Your Honor, my client is seeking emergency custody of his daughter based on the mother's clearly inappropriate living situation and moral choices that create an unstable environment for the child." "And what exactly constitutes an inappropriate living situation, Ms. Walsh?" Judge Henley asked, her tone neutral. "The respondent is currently living in an unmarried cohabitation arrangement with a man she's known for less than 3 months, Your Honor. She moved directly from her marital home into his residence, creating questions about her judgment and priorities." Crystal felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but Sarah Martinez stood calmly. "Your Honor, if I may clarify the timeline and circumstances." "Please do, Ms. Martinez." "Mr. Higgins abandoned Ms. Freeman during active labor," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "He left the hospital while she was giving birth to their child and never returned. He emptied their joint bank account and disappeared for 2 months, leaving a new mother with no financial support and no communication." Judge Henley's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is this accurate, Ms. Walsh?" Stephen's lawyer looked uncomfortable. "Your Honor, my client admits he made mistakes. He was overwhelmed by the birth experience and needed time to process." "He needed time to process," Judge Henley repeated flatly, while his wife was alone with a newborn baby and no money. "Mr. Higgins has since recognized his errors and is prepared to take full responsibility." "Ms. Martinez," Judge Henley interrupted, "please continue with your timeline." "Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Freeman was forced to seek emergency assistance. Mr. Lockhart, who had helped during the birth when Mr. Higgins abandoned her, offered her employment and housing. Their relationship developed naturally over time as they worked together, and he helped care for the child Mr. Higgins had abandoned." "I see. And Mr. Lockhart is present today?" Brian stood. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Henley studied him for a long moment. "Mr. Lockhart, you're aware this is a custody hearing for a child who isn't biologically yours?" "Yes, Your Honor. But with respect, Zara feels like my daughter. I've been present for every milestone Mr. Higgins missed. First smile, first laugh, first solid food. I love that little girl as if she were my own." "And Ms. Freeman? How do you characterize your relationship with her?" Brian's voice was steady and sure. "I love her, Your Honor. We're engaged to be married. We want to build a family together and give Zara the stable, loving home she deserves." A murmur went through the courtroom at the engagement announcement. Crystal saw Stephen's face darken with anger. "When did this engagement occur?" Judge Henley asked. "Last night, Your Honor," Brian replied honestly, "after I nearly died in a storm and realized I was tired of waiting for the perfect moment to tell the woman I love how I feel about her." Stephen's lawyer shot to her feet. "Your Honor, this engagement is clearly a manipulation designed to influence these proceedings." "Objection," Sarah Martinez said calmly. "Speculation and argumentative." "Sustained," Judge Henley said. "Ms. Walsh, if you have evidence of manipulation, present it. Otherwise, move on." The morning proceeded with testimony from both sides. Stephen took the stand and painted himself as a reformed man, ready to take responsibility for his daughter. He claimed Crystal had moved on too quickly, that her judgment was compromised by her relationship with Brian. "I made mistakes," Stephen said, looking directly at the judge. "I was young and scared, and I handled things badly. But I'm ready now to be the father Zara needs. I can provide stability, a traditional family structure, without the complications of my ex-wife's current situation. Under cross-examination, Sarah Martinez was ruthless but professional. Mr. Higgins, you testified that you were scared during the birth. What specifically frightened you? The blood, the chaos, the possibility something could go wrong. But nothing did go wrong, correct? The birth proceeded normally. Well, yes, but... And rather than staying to support your wife, you left the hospital entirely. I needed air. For 2 months. Stephen's face reddened. I needed time to think. While your wife struggled alone with a newborn and no money. I wasn't thinking clearly. Clearly enough to empty the bank account on your way out of town. Stephen's lawyer objected. But the damage was done. Stephen looked petulant and selfish on the stand, his excuses thin and unconvincing. When Crystal took the stand, her hands were shaking, but her voice was clear and strong. She told her story honestly. Stephen's abandonment, her desperation, Brian's unexpected kindness that had grown into love. Ms. Freeman, Stephen's lawyer said during cross-examination, isn't it true that you moved in with Mr. Lockhart within days of giving birth? I moved into the cottage on his property, Crystal corrected. A separate residence. He offered me employment and housing when I had nowhere else to turn. Employment that conveniently included living accommodations. Employment that allowed me to support my daughter while recovering from childbirth, yes. And you began a romantic relationship with your employer very quickly, didn't you? Crystal felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. Our relationship developed naturally over time as we worked together, and he showed kindness to both me and my daughter. The daughter he's now claiming to love as his own. The daughter he's helped raise while her biological father was absent, Crystal shot back. The daughter who lights up when she sees him, who reaches for him when she's upset, who knows him as the only father figure she's ever had. The judge called a brief recess. In the hallway, Crystal collapsed into Brian's arms, emotionally drained from the morning's testimony. You did great, he murmured against her hair. You told the truth with dignity and strength. That's all we can do. When court resumed, Sarah Martinez called several character witnesses. Indy testified about Crystal's devotion as a mother and nurse. Dr. Martinez from the hospital testified about Stephen's abandonment during the birth and Brian's unexpected assistance. Nova testified about watching Crystal and Brian's relationship develop and seeing how Brian had stepped into a father role for Zara. Finally, Sarah called Brian to testify about his intentions and commitment. Mr. Lockhart, she asked, what are your plans regarding Zara if you're awarded the right to help raise her? We want to adopt her legally, Brian said without hesitation. We want to give her my name, ensure her financial security, and provide her with a stable, loving family. We want more children too, so Zara would have siblings. And if your relationship with Ms. Freeman ended? It won't, Brian said simply. But, hypothetically, I would still want to maintain a relationship with Zara. She would always be my daughter, regardless of circumstances. Judge Henley looked thoughtful as the testimony concluded. I'm going to take a brief recess to review my notes before rendering a decision. The wait felt eternal. Crystal paced the courthouse hallway, Brian's arm around her shoulders, both of them too nervous to sit still. Finally, they were called back into the courtroom. Judge Henley looked serious as she addressed the room. This case has presented some unique circumstances. We have a father who admits to abandoning his child during birth and remaining absent for 2 months, and a mother who formed a new relationship during a vulnerable time period. Crystal's heart was hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. However, Judge Henley continued, the evidence clearly shows that Mr. Higgins voluntarily abandoned his parental responsibilities at a crucial time, while Mr. Lockhart stepped in to provide stability and support. The child's best interests must be the determining factor here. She looked directly at Stephen. Mr. Higgins, Your actions during and after your daughter's birth demonstrate a concerning pattern of abandoning responsibility when faced with stress. While you claim to be reformed, you've provided no evidence of sustained change or commitment. Then she turned to Crystal and Brian. Ms. Freeman, while your relationship timeline may raise eyebrows among some, the evidence shows you consistently put your daughter's needs first. Mr. Lockhart's commitment to both you and the child appears genuine and sustained. Crystal held her breath. Therefore, Judge Henley said, I'm denying Mr. Higgins' petition for emergency custody. The child will remain with her mother. However, I am granting Mr. Higgins supervised visitation rights, contingent on his completion of parenting classes and counseling. Crystal nearly collapsed with relief. Brian's arm tightened around her as Stephen's face darkened with fury. Furthermore, Judge Henley continued, I'm recommending that social services conduct a follow-up visit in 6 months to ensure the child's continued welfare. This court is adjourned. As the gavel fell, Crystal felt like she could breathe for the first time in weeks. They had won. Zara was safe. Their family was protected. Stephen stormed out without a word, his mother trailing behind him with a venomous look at Crystal. But Crystal didn't care. She was too busy being crushed in Brian's embrace, tears of relief streaming down her face. We did it, she whispered against his chest. We actually did it. We're a family, Brian said, his voice thick with emotion. Legally, officially, completely, nothing can separate us now. And as they walked out of the courthouse together, hand in hand, Crystal knew he was right. They had fought for their love and won. The future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility. Chapter 9. The Price of Love. Victory tastes sweet until you realize the war isn't over, and sometimes the hardest battle is the one you fight against your own fears. 6 months had passed since the custody hearing, and Crystal should have been happier than she'd ever been in her life. The social services visit had gone perfectly. Zara was thriving, clearly bonded to both Crystal and Brian, and living in a stable, loving environment. Stephen's supervised visits had been sporadic at best. He'd completed only half his required parenting classes before disappearing again, this time apparently for good. Crystal and Brian were planning their wedding for the spring, a small ceremony in the garden overlooking the harbour. Zara was crawling now, pulling herself up on furniture, and had taken to calling Brian Dada, much to his delight and Crystal's amazement. Their life together was everything she'd dreamed of and more, so why did she feel like she was holding her breath, waiting for something terrible to happen? The answer came on a grey December morning, when Crystal found herself standing at the cottage window, watching Brian play with Zara in the living room. 9-month-old Zara was giggling as Brian made silly faces at her, her chubby hands reaching for his nose. The sight should have filled Crystal with joy, but instead she felt a familiar tightness in her chest. You're doing it again, Indy said from behind her. Crystal's friend had stopped by for their weekly coffee, a tradition that had helped keep Crystal grounded through all the chaos of the past year. Doing what? Crystal asked, though she knew exactly what Indy meant. Pulling away, creating distance. I can see it in your eyes, honey. You're getting scared again. Crystal sighed and turned away from the window. I'm not scared, I'm just realistic. Realistic about what? About how long this can last. About whether I really deserve all this happiness. About whether I'm enough for him. Indy set down her coffee cup with more force than necessary. Crystal Freeman, you are the most stubborn woman I've ever met. You've got a man who loves you desperately, a daughter who adores you both, a beautiful home, and a bright future ahead of you. What more do you need to convince you that you deserve this? It's too good to be true, Crystal said quietly. Things like this don't happen to people like me. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Brian to realize he could do better, for something to go wrong. And what if nothing goes wrong? What if this is just your life now? What if you're allowed to be happy? Crystal didn't answer because she honestly didn't know. She'd been poor, abandoned, looked down on for so long that accepting love and security felt almost foreign. Part of her kept expecting to wake up and find it had all been a dream. "I think I need some space," Crystal said suddenly. "Some time to think, to figure out if I'm really ready for all this." Indy stared at her in disbelief. "Space? Crystal, you're engaged to be married in 4 months. You're planning a life together. This isn't the time for space." "Maybe that's the problem," Crystal said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I rushed into this because I was grateful, because I needed rescuing, not because I was truly ready for forever." "Do you love him?" "Of course I love him." "Does he love you?" "Yes, but does he treat you well, respect you, make you feel valued and cherished?" "Yes, but that's not the point." "That's exactly the point." Indy's voice rose, causing Brian to look over from where he was playing with Zara. "You're sabotaging your own happiness because you think you don't deserve it. And you know what? If you keep this up, you're going to lose the best thing that ever happened to you." Crystal saw Brian approaching, Zara in his arms, his expression concerned. "Everything okay over here? You two sound pretty intense." "Everything's fine," Crystal said quickly, but Brian's intuitive gaze told her he wasn't buying it. "Crystal?" he asked gently. "What's wrong?" Looking into his grey eyes, seeing the love and worry there, Crystal felt her resolve crumble. I think maybe we should postpone the wedding." The words hung in the air like a bomb blast. Brian went very still, and even Zara seemed to sense the tension, her happy babbling quieting. "Postpone it?" Brian asked carefully. "Why?" "I just think we might be moving too fast. We've only known each other for 8 months, and so much has happened. The custody battle, almost losing you in the storm, all the stress. Maybe we should take some time to make sure this is really what we both want." Brian was quiet for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he handed Zara to Indy, who took the baby with obvious reluctance. "I think Indy and Zara should go for a walk while we talk," he said quietly. Indy shot Crystal a look that clearly said, "You're making a huge mistake," but she gathered Zara's things and left without argument. Once they were alone, Brian turned to face Crystal fully. "What's this really about?" "I told you." "No. You told me what you think I want to hear. Now tell me the truth. Are you having second thoughts about marrying me?" Crystal sank into one of the kitchen chairs, suddenly exhausted. "I don't know. Maybe. I just keep feeling like I'm living someone else's life. Like I'm playing house in a fairy tale that's going to end any minute." Brian sat across from her, his expression serious but patient. "Crystal, do you remember what you told me the night I almost died in the storm?" "I told you a lot of things that night. You told me you didn't care what anyone thought anymore. You said you just wanted me to come home. You said you were done being afraid." Crystal felt tears prick her eyes. "Maybe I spoke too soon. Or maybe you meant every word, and fear is trying to talk you out of the best decision you ever made." He reached across the table and took her hands in his. "Crystal, I need you to really listen to me. I love you. Not because you need rescuing, not because I feel sorry for you, not because you're convenient or grateful. I love you because you're brave and strong and beautiful inside and out. I love the way you put Zara first in everything. I love how you organize my chaos and make my house feel like a home. I love that you challenge me to be better than I was. But what if—" "No what ifs," Brian said firmly. "I learned that lesson in the storm, remember? What if the sky falls? What if the ocean boils? What if aliens invade? We can't live our lives preparing for disasters that might never happen." Crystal looked down at their joined hands. At the engagement ring that had become so much a part of her, she barely noticed it anymore. "I'm scared," she admitted in a small voice. "I know. I'm scared too. Marriage is scary. Love is scary. But you know what's scarier? Living without it. Going through life playing it safe, never taking risks, never allowing yourself to be truly happy because you're afraid it won't last. He lifted one hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. Crystal, you are not your past. You are not the woman Stephen abandoned. You are not the mistakes other people made or the pain they caused you. You are the woman who brought a beautiful daughter into this world with courage and grace. You are the woman who took a chance on a stranger who offered her hope. You are the woman I fell in love with, and I am never going to stop loving you. How can you be so sure? Crystal whispered. Because I know what life looks like without you, and I never want to go back to that. Because when I look at you holding Zara, I see our future. Because when you smile at me across the breakfast table, I feel like the luckiest man alive. Because you're not just the woman I want to marry. You're the woman I choose to love every single day for the rest of my life. Crystal felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening to let in light. She'd been so focused on whether she deserved this love that she'd forgotten the most important question. Did she want it? And the answer was yes. God, yes. She wanted this life, this man, this family they'd built together. She wanted forever with Brian, wanted to watch Zara grow up with a father who adored her, wanted to give them both siblings and build something beautiful and lasting. I'm sorry, she said, fresh tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry I got scared. I'm sorry I almost ruined this because I was too afraid to believe I could have it. You didn't ruin anything, Brian said, pulling her into his arms. You're human. You've been hurt before and you're protecting yourself the only way you know how. I understand that. I don't want to postpone the wedding, Crystal said against his chest. I want to marry you. I want to be your wife and Zara's mother, and build a life together that's so full of love, it makes up for all the lonely years that came before. Are you sure? Brian asked, pulling back to look at her. Because I need you to be sure, Crystal. Not just hopeful or grateful or caught up in the moment. I need you to be absolutely certain that this is what you want. Crystal looked into his eyes, those storm-grey eyes that had been her anchor through so many difficult moments, and felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket. I'm sure, she said without hesitation. I love you, Brian Lockhart. I want to spend the rest of my life proving it to you. Brian's smile was radiant as he leaned down to kiss her, pouring all his love and relief and joy into the connection between them. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. No more doubts, he asked. No more doubts, Crystal confirmed. At least not about this. About us. I might still worry about other things, whether I'm a good mother, whether I'll burn dinner, whether Zara will like her wedding dress, but not about whether I want to marry you. Never about that. Good, Brian said, kissing her again, because I have something to tell you. What? I may have already sent out the wedding invitations. Crystal stared at him. You what? Well, technically Nova sent them out, but I figured if you were going to change your mind, you'd do it before we got to the actual printing stage. So I went ahead and mailed them yesterday. Brian Lockhart, you are the most presumptuous, arrogant, confident, he corrected with a grin. I prefer confident. I was confident that the woman I fell in love with wouldn't let fear win. And I was right. Crystal started to laugh, and once she started, she couldn't stop. Here she'd been agonizing over whether to postpone their wedding, and he'd already sent out invitations. It was so perfectly Brian, practical, optimistic, and absolutely certain of their love. I love you, she said, when she finally caught her breath. Even when you make major decisions without consulting me. I love you too, Brian replied. Even when you try to sabotage our happiness because you think you don't deserve it. As they held each other in the cottage kitchen, Crystal felt the last of her fears melt away. She was done running from love, done questioning whether she deserved happiness. She was ready to claim the life they'd built together, ready to walk down the aisle and promise Brian forever, ready to be the wife and mother and woman she was meant to be. The wedding was 4 months away, and Crystal couldn't wait. Chapter 10. Love's Perfect Storm. Sometimes the most beautiful moments come when all the storms have passed, and you realize that love isn't just about surviving the darkness. It's about choosing to dance in the light. The lighthouse stood like a sentinel against the April sky, its white walls gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Crystal had transformed the historic structure into something magical. Fairy lights twinkled from every window, white roses cascaded down the curved walls, and the golden light seemed to bless everything it touched. It was exactly 1 year since the storm that nearly claimed Brian, and she couldn't imagine a more perfect place to become his wife. "You're glowing," Sage whispered, adjusting Crystal's dress one final time. The ivory silk flowed like water, with delicate lace sleeves that caught the lighthouse beam. Tiny white flowers crowned her dark hair, and the diamond ring sparkled like captured starlight. "I can't stop smiling," Crystal admitted, her reflection radiant with joy. Indy appeared with Zara, who looked like a tiny angel in her white dress and flower crown. "That man downstairs is about to wear a hole in the dock from pacing. I think he's more nervous than you are." Crystal moved to the lighthouse window. Below, guests filled the garden, their chosen family of 50 souls who'd supported them through every storm. And there, by the harbour's edge, stood Brian in his charcoal suit, hands running through his dark hair, looking devastatingly handsome and utterly terrified. "He's afraid I'll change my mind," Crystal said softly. "Will you?" Sage teased. "Never. This is my forever." A gentle knock interrupted them. Dr. Martinez peeked in, smiling. "The groom sent me. He needs confirmation you're still planning to marry him." "Tell him," Crystal said, voice strong and certain, "that I've been ready since the moment he said I was his." The spiral staircase seemed to glow as they descended, Crystal's dress whispering against ancient stone. At the bottom, Nova waited with tears sparkling in her eyes. "Ready, my dear?" Crystal nodded, and the lighthouse door opened. The garden had become an enchanted realm. Rose petals carpeted the path, fairy lights danced between trees, and an archway of white blooms framed the altar where Brian waited. The string quartet's melody floated on the harbour breeze like a prayer. Every head turned, but Crystal saw only Brian. He stood frozen, storm-grey eyes wide with wonder as if seeing a miracle. When their gazes met, his face transformed with such raw love that several guests gasped audibly. His lips moved silently. Beautiful. Crystal began her walk toward forever. Each step felt sacred, each breath a promise. Halfway down the aisle, Zara reached for her with a delighted "Mama!" and the guests chuckled as Crystal paused to kiss her daughter's cheek. At the altar, Brian stepped forward, hands trembling as he took hers. "Hi," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Hi," she replied, unable to contain her radiant smile. "I was terrified you'd realize you could do better." "Impossible," Crystal said firmly. "You're my choice. Today, tomorrow, always." The minister's voice carried over the harbour breeze. "We gather today to witness something rare, a love that has weathered every storm and emerged stronger. Brian and Crystal have chosen to write their own vows." Brian's hands shook as he unfolded his paper, then he looked up and let it flutter away in the breeze. "I don't need notes for this." He took her hands, his voice carrying to every corner of the garden. "Crystal, a year ago I walked into a hospital room and found my entire world. You were bringing life into existence with such fierce courage that I knew instantly this woman could teach me how to truly live." Tears slipped down Crystal's cheeks as he continued. "When I said you were mine that night, I thought I was protecting you. I had no idea you were saving me. You've shown me that love isn't just about the beautiful moments. It's about choosing each other when things fall apart, fighting for each other when the world says we don't belong. His voice cracked with emotion. I promise to love you through every storm that comes. I promise to be your safe harbor when you need shelter, your lighthouse when you lose your way. I promise to be the father Zara deserves and the partner you can count on. You are mine, Crystal Freeman, and I am forever, completely, joyfully yours. The lighthouse beams swept across them as if in blessing, and Crystal felt the universe itself witnessing their love. Brian, she began, her voice clear as crystal bells, you saved me before I even knew I needed saving. You stayed when staying was hard, loved when loving was risky, fought when fighting seemed impossible. She squeezed his hands, drawing strength from his unwavering gaze. You didn't just give me a home. You gave me hope that happily ever after isn't just in fairy tales. You proved that broken hearts can heal stronger, that love can conquer fear, that sometimes the storm brings exactly what you need. Crystal's voice rose with conviction. I promise to love you with everything I am, to be your partner in dreams and your comfort in sorrow, to give Zara the family she deserves, and to build with you a love so strong it becomes legend. You saw me when I couldn't see myself, Brian Lockhart. And I choose you, today, tomorrow, and for all our tomorrows. The minister's eyes shone with tears. The rings? Nova stepped forward with trembling hands as Brian lifted Crystal's ring. With this ring, he said, sliding it home, I claim you as mine forever. Crystal took his ring, her hands steady now. With this ring, she whispered, I give you my heart, my life, my everything. The minister raised his arms to heaven. By the power of love that has brought you together and the faith that will keep you strong, I pronounce you husband and wife. He grinned at Brian. Now kiss your bride before she changes her mind. Brian cupped Crystal's face with infinite tenderness, his thumbs brushing away her tears of joy. Mrs. Lockhart, he breathed. Forever, she whispered back. Their kiss was everything, promise and passion, past and future, storm and sunshine, all wrapped in one perfect moment. The guests erupted in celebration, but Crystal heard only her heart singing Brian's name. When they broke apart, Sage was there with Zara, who clapped her tiny hands in delight. Brian scooped his daughter up, and for one shining moment, the three of them stood bathed in lighthouse gold, a family complete. The reception swirled around them like a beautiful dream, but as the sun set and stars emerged, Crystal and Brian found themselves alone on the lighthouse balcony, Zara sleeping peacefully in Brian's arms. Any regrets, Mrs. Lockhart? He asked softly. Crystal looked out over the harbour where their love story began, then up at the lighthouse beam, sweeping protectively over their new life. Only one, she said with a mysterious smile. Brian's face clouded with concern. What? Crystal rose on her toes, pressing close to whisper in his ear the words that would echo in his heart forever. I regret that I can only marry you once in this lifetime. And as the lighthouse beam embraced them one final time, Brian threw back his head and laughed with pure joy, knowing that some storms destroy everything in their path. But others, the magical ones, bring you exactly the love you were always meant to find. Thanks for listening. I love you. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video. Take care.